And the next to speak is David Whyte, speaking about ecocide and its link to the genocide.
Hello, I'm David Whyte, Director of the Centre for Climate Crime and Climate Justice at Queen Mary University of London. Members of the Jury of Conscience, this presentation sets out the indivisible links between the genocide and the ecocide in Gaza, and a fully referenced and sourced extended version of this evidence is with the jury. Ecocidal attacks on environmental infrastructure are, as we've just heard, undoubtedly a conscious part of the Israeli military strategy. By environmental infrastructure, I mean infrastructure that ensures the integrity and cleanliness of land, water, air, and biodiversity, including agriculture and drinking water, of course, again, as we've just heard. Removing the capacity of the people of Gaza to produce drinkable and usable water has been a central part of Israel's war effort, clearly. The release of huge amounts of raw sewage every day has contaminated land and water courses, including aquifer and the Mediterranean coast, ensuring disease proliferation. The destruction of agricultural land, including the deliberate destruction of almost all of Gaza's orchards and most of its arable land, as well as the targeting of fishing grounds and the capacity to fish, has also been part of a sustained and deliberate attempt to render Gaza unlivable. The ecocide in Gaza cannot in any sense be thought of as distinct from the genocide. Ecocide is a central part of the military strategy. In this ecocide-genocide, the annihilation of the Palestinian people is indivisible from the destruction of Palestinian land fertility, air quality, food sources and water supplies that people rely on to live. Israel fires on and bombs food queues, water infrastructure and sanitation plants for this reason, just as it destroys agricultural production and fishing boats and nets for this reason. Israel has repeatedly justified such attacks by claiming that Hamas uses civilian resources for military purposes. According to Israeli officials, Hamas hides weapons in or launches attacks from civilian locations, even aid convoys, and in this way, all of the infrastructure that sustains life is transformed by the Israeli state into a legitimate military target. It's here that we see the articulation of a principle that's been central to this genocide, ecocide, that there's a symbiosis between civilian and military targets, to the point that the Israeli state argues it's pointless and at times counterproductive to separate them. So if the analysis of ecocide in previous military conflicts revealed a blurring of the distinction between civilians and combatants, the Israeli state has wholly eradicated this distinction for its own political and military operational purposes. The open declaration that all life be treated as a legitimate target can only be understood as a supreme declaration of racism. Palestinians must be categorized and treated as a homogeneous and expendable terrorist population. Palestinians must be racialized to the point that Palestinian lives are seen as nothing more than an inconvenient but expendable obstacle to achieve a military goal. While this is by no means unique in warfare, in our historical experience, Israel's genocidal attack on Gaza has perhaps seen the highest point at which this is openly boasted about and justified by its perpetrators. Israel's explicit justifications for a scorched earth military strategy raise these profound questions about why this strategy has been tolerated or sustained by the most powerful international states. It also raises crucial questions about the supine nature of the structures of international law to prevent this genocide, ecocide, and about the realpolitik of Israel's brutality. Historically, Israel has been an important channel for both European and US geopolitical interests in the Middle East. The attack on Gaza cannot be described as a war for oil per se, yet the Israeli war machine is only sustained because oil is in the Middle East. The attack on Gaza is therefore inextricably bound up with geopolitical and specifically oil and gas interests. This is a crucial entry point for understanding the attacks on Gaza as part of a longer ecocidal military campaign. I now want to set out some of the measures of the deliberate destruction of environmental infrastructure. In terms of the debris that's been created, the large-scale destruction of Gaza's urban infrastructure has produced an estimated 61.4 million tons of debris. That's more than 20 times that generated by all other military attacks on Gaza since 2008. The debris is heavily contaminated with asbestos, industrial and medical waste, heavy metals, and of course human remains, and is a major source of disease. The debris also contains huge amounts of unexploded military ordnance, estimated at 5 to 10% of the total dropped on Gaza, still in the rubble unexploded. 2.91 million tons of debris in industrial areas are contaminated with chemicals and other hazardous materials, with over 250,000 tons potentially containing heavy metals from destroyed photovoltaic cells, that's solar panels, of course. It's estimated that safe disposal of the rubble will require over 700 hectares of landfill, a completely unviable option in Gaza's densely populated and land-constrained context. And I want to stress this, that in this respect, under the Oslo II Accords, hazardous waste, all of the waste I've just mentioned, must be transferred to Israel pending establishment of Palestinian disposal facilities. This is a mandate that applies to all waste, the waste created by Israeli attacks since October 2023 included. But of course, this does not feature in the so-called Gaza peace plan. In terms of air quality, the destruction of energy infrastructure and the blockade has led to an exponential rise, as we've just heard, in the burning of wood, plastic and other waste materials, and that has released high concentrations of particulate matter, dioxins and other highly toxic compounds. Emissions from munition explosions and fires in bomb structures, including industrial facilities, have released significant quantities of highly toxic chemicals. Deaths caused by acute respiratory infections have been rising rapidly throughout those attacks. Water quality, the UN Environment Programme in June 2024 had already reported that water sanitation and hygiene systems are almost entirely defunct. Earlier this year, the Palestinian Water Authority reported that over 85% of Gaza's water and sanitation infrastructure is inoperable. Gaza now primarily relies on groundwater sources, 97% of which is considered unsuitable for human use. The major public health emergency that we've heard about includes the risk of a cholera epidemic and actually more recently the emergence of cases of polio in children. I want to stress the deliberate nature of this, and there is evidence, for example, from the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard that analysed satellite data of damage to water facilities in Gaza and found that the damage did not follow a random pattern as it would if it was consistent with so-called collateral damage as a consequence of a general bombing campaign. Rather, over time, bombing mapping reveals a pattern of damage that is tightly clustered around water facilities, and this analysis estimated a less than 1% likelihood that this damage was random. It therefore concluded that Israel's military actions intentionally decimated civilian infrastructure in water in its attack on Gaza. In terms of agriculture and land quality, Israeli military operations have used bulldozers to destroy Palestinian arable land for many years, and since at least 2014 this tactic has been complemented by the aerial spraying of herbicides, which have destroyed large areas of fertile farming land in Gaza, often without any warning. And as Mazen has just documented, there's a much longer history of this. During the current onslaught, this tactic has been systemized in significantly new ways. The creation of a perimeter zone in Gaza in which everything was destroyed, living or not, exemplifies this systematization. As one report based on the testimonies of Israeli soldiers reported, and I quote, "Soldiers were given orders to deliberately, methodically and systematically annihilate whatever was within the designated perimeter, including entire residential neighborhoods, public buildings, educational institutions, mosques, cemeteries, with very few exceptions, industrial zones and agricultural areas which served the entire population were laid to waste regardless of whether those areas had any connection whatsoever to the fighting, so-called fighting. In fact, there were shoot-to-kill orders given in those perimeter zones. And this is not only the logic at the perimeter, the same shoot-to-kill orders for anyone who entered that perimeter zone at all or who was spotted in the vicinity. This is not only the logic at the perimeter, the same scorched earth orders have been generally applied across Gaza. By 2025, the damage to crops in Gaza by bombing and military operations was assessed by the UN Environmental Programme as 97% of tree crops, 82% of annual crops, including greenhouses, 95% of shrubland, and 89% of grass fallow land. This is absolutely part of the deliberate starvation of Gaza that we heard from Hani Almadoun and Hilal Elver earlier in this session. There will certainly be some permanent loss of fertile soil in Gaza with irreversible ecological consequences. So in summary, the destruction of agriculture, water purification and energy infrastructure is central to the military goal, a sustained and systematic strategy to eradicate the capacity for Palestinian life in Gaza now and severely limiting the capacity to survive at any point into the future. The targeting of environmental infrastructure has been a particular feature of wars in the Middle East for a long time. There's a pattern that runs through Iraq, Lebanon, and Gaza that environmental infrastructure is particularly targeted as a mode of warfare. And crucially, as Shuradeh Malavi, who we'll hear from later, has shown, this is unfolded in Gaza as a shift from targeting environmental structure in order to gain military advantage to targeting environmental structure as an end in itself. At key moments in this war on Gaza, the main protagonists have themselves publicly declared their culpability in taking decisions that are calculated to attack the conditions of the life of the entire population of those that remain in Gaza, making survival close to impossible. They must be held accountable for the unimaginable hell they have brought to Gaza. We will never forget, and we can never stop fighting for accountability for those who are responsible for this hell. Thank you.